Yeah, I'll just do an introduction and then we'll kick off. So Shruti did a recording note, but just we'll have a talk from Professor James, and then we'll have a discussion with questions at the end. So you can either note questions as we go along or put them in the chat, or later raise your hand and you can speak them yourself, so you can have Shruti or me say them as well. So just keep that in mind. Okay, great. So today, which we should note and reflect upon as known variously in the USA as a National Day of Mourning since 1970, organised by the United American Indians of New England, as Unthanksgiving Day since 1975, organised by the International Treaty Council on American Indian Contemporary Arts, and as a federal holiday, Thanksgiving, marking the 1621 first Thanksgiving by Pilgrim colonial settlers, proclaimed by George Washington in 1789 and made a paid federal workers' holiday in 1885. We are honoured to continue this term's discussion groups that introduce us to Africana philosophy by hearing from Professor James on Abolition and Acquiescence, the role of political imprisonment in analysing and obscuring US rebellions. Professor James has much to teach us on how to trace, face and act in response to destructive complications of the world's social systems through philosophy. As Ebenezer Fitch Professor of Humanities at Williams College, Massachusetts, USA, Professor James's work continually surfaces lived nuances underlying cultural narratives. This includes Memory, Shame and Rage, the Central Park Case, shadowboxing representations of Black feminist politics, Transcending the Talented 10th, Black Leaders and American Intellectuals, the Angela Y. Davis Reader, Resisting State Violence, Radicalism, Gender and Race in US Culture, Imprisoned Intellectual, America's Political Readers, Right on Life, Liberation and Rebellion, and Seeking the Beloved Community, a Feminist Race Reader. As you will note from these titles, she writes on political theory, political imprisonment, and the Captive Maternal, as particularly discussed in the podcast learning resource we shared for today. And so we at APP, from our positions as students at universities ourselves, have a lot to learn from Professor James's works, and we are, again, therefore, most eager to welcome her today. So please welcome Professor James with me.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And as I said earlier, I'm very much interested in the conversation, especially with you all as young scholars and intellectuals, and also based on your interest and your experiences in activism. I'm going to talk about abolitionism a bit. I'm going to talk about community intellectuals, the Captive Maternal, the Black Internationalist Unions, or BIUs, which is mostly Black women academics, but we remain anonymous. Our name is nowhere on that site. It's part of the Abolition Collective, which began a number of years ago, about 2015, I believe. And last conference that's tentatively titled The Spirit of Nelson Mandela, and we've had some debates about that title. I've suggested adding Fannie Lou Hamer. I could explain that more. It's going to be a tribunal in 2021 in the United States, in New York City, and it will follow the tradition that the Civil Rights Congress set in 1951. So this would be the 70th anniversary, when they did the pamphlet, We Charge Genocide, which looked at the experience of people of African descent in the United States, noted the lynchings, the economic exploitation, and used the UN Convention doctrine on the prevention and elimination of genocide to speak about cultural, material, political, physical expropriation, extraction, and devastation on these shores. And yes, blessings to everyone on what should be a First Peoples Liberation Day. And hopefully, even though that's not central to my talk, I understand that that is the foundation of all of our diasporas and our struggles for freedom. So beginning with abolitionism, all right, so I'm gonna say some of the bio stuff of my own, because my argument is that my capacity to be an intellectual is shaped by political experiences, right? So decades ago, because it's been decades ago, I was organizing for a women's organization in New York City that was basically a front group for the Communist Party USA. I was asked at one point, because I can organize better than I can think and write, if I would join the party. I declined, and then I was sort of kicked to the curb because I didn't understand the dynamics of a very disciplined organization that prided a certain kind of, I wouldn't call it loyalty because I was loyal and I was working my bottom off, but it was very much an in-group that had a set hierarchy and that would want conformity. So I'm a bit of a nonconformist thinker and a dedicated activist, but not in those traditional ways that aligned at least with that party's needs. But it was through the party that I met Angela Davis, right? And I met Davis several times. So in New York City at a talk that she first gave, in '85 at the UN Decade on Women in Nairobi, where we were the US organization called Women for Racial and Economic Equality was an affiliate of the WIDF, which was based in what was formerly East Germany, right? The Women's International Democratic Federation. So this was an anti-fascist women's group that came out after World War II, emerged, right? And would be loyal to the Soviet governmental structure, but would be supportive of women who were fighting in different formations around the globe against US imperialism. And there are critiques to be made of the Soviet Union, I'm just not giving them here. But so eventually when we were at this compound in '85, that's where I met women who were coming from El Salvador, women who were with the ANC in SWAPO, right, in Southern Africa, women, I mean, I could go around the globe. There were hundreds of women housed there. And that was the first time I was introduced to a certain kind of internationalism. But again, it was internationalism structured by certain kind of political formations. So I would describe them as abolitionists, but abolitionists in the sense that they belong to a governing elite, which represented a mass. So that was going to be different from the kind of street rebellions that I would see later in New York City, right? And participate in some of them, anti-police, anti-NYPD formations. So that's '85. Later, met Davis again in Moscow in '88 for a conference with Gorbachev and Robert Mugabe, women's organization. But the men were the keynote speakers. From there, there would be organizing in Alabama against racist formations, the resurgence of the Klan, et cetera, et cetera. So the fast forward is in the '90s when I had a postdoc, I took it to UC Santa Cruz where Professor Davis was teaching. And so Professor Davis is the person who introduced me to abolitionism as a US phenomenon of struggle in the 20th century. So yes, Frederick Douglass and others from the 19th century. In the 20th century, that was going to be based in the academy. And that was the first time I experienced in abolitionism, which I give it an adjective, I call it academic abolitionism, that works within structure again. So it has the infrastructure of the academy. It has academics as sort of the ruling governing elites. It cannot offend its funder, which is the university because they're paying for this, or the nonprofits that are contributing to putting on these events. The one I wrote about, an airbrushing revolution for the sake of abolition, that was pretty much the largest endeavor I'd ever done and the largest conference at University of Colorado Boulder at the time. And that was where I pretty much separated from academic abolitionism. I did edit an anthology from that conference where Davis keynoted, and the conference was done at her request. Unfinished Liberation, it was titled after one of her UCLA lectures in 1969 before she lost her position due to the regents and then Governor Ronald Reagan's anti-communism and their racism and sexism. So we did states of confinement. I had negotiated with the publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, to ship 50 books inside of prisons because I'd known Panthers from Harlem, which is not the West Coast. So the West Coast Panthers, the California Panthers, I was not familiar with. I kind of found them very complicated and contradictory. the East Coast Panthers from Harlem, I understood better, in part because I did graduate school in New York City and I was able to meet them personally. You know, even though the party had long since fallen to disarray, I was able to meet those who had survived the decay of the party and also the violence meted out by COINTELPRO. When I sent that anthology inside, it was one Panther who also went to the BLA after George Jackson was, Michel Foucault calls it an assassination, was killed in prison in California. And this sparked the Attica Rebellion that will have its 50th anniversary next year. So when I got a note back from this person who'd been incarcerated for, at that time, about 20 years, they were released last October, about 8 weeks ago, after they finished their 49th year in prison. They wrote that the anthology was fine, but well, they didn't say fine. They said it, thanks for the book, but, and then they levied a critique about all the deficiencies, which I now track back to academic intellectualism, right? That, you know, of course, Davis was the keynote and she had been in jail for 17 months, but the experience, and I have never been incarcerated, so I'm sure that experience, I know that experience is devastating, but it's different from people who've been in for decades and who've been in prisons, not in jail, and who did not have an international apparatus, in part funded and supported by the Communist Party, right? Not just in the United States, but internationally, right? But who fought as Black liberators for people who have been historically disposed of by the state for, you know, 400 years plus. And so his commentary, it was Jalil Muntaqim, right? His commentary is what set me on a path of about a decade of anthologizing only political prisoners who engaged in rebellion, right? So Davis's charges were, you know, and she was defended and exonerated, were based on the fact that she did not participate in a rebellion, that Jonathan Jackson's 17-year-old brother, George Jackson, somehow got hold of her guns. My understanding is Jonathan was her bodyguard, so her guns were his guns, but, you know, that could be seen as a technicality. So her defense is based on innocence. The political prisoner's defense is based on the right to rebel and to protect their lives from a state that was executing them, you know, without any pretense of legal justification, even though I don't think there's a legal justification for taking life in terms of the state. So what became a signifying event in 1969, December 4th, 1969, was the assassination of Fred Hampton in Chicago. And that shaped the way in which people thought of themselves in the Black Panther Party. And sorry, the way in which they understood this to be not about breakfast programs or just dealing with the police who were violent in the locale, but they understood this to be a war. So when the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover said the Black Panther Party was the #1 threat to the internal security of the United States, that meant they were saying about 200 people, average age was like 19 to 21, were able to take down an empire, which technically wasn't true, but it was necessary on some level in order to justify extrajudicial killings. So Fred Hampton was drugged. There was a raid. It was a joint effort between the Chicago Police Department and the FBI. Mark Clark had also been drugged. There was an informant who was the head of their security, who it's allegedly stated had helped to drug them. But the door was kicked in. Mark Clark was already in a stupor and his shotgun sort of went off. He was killed instantly, shotgun blast to the chest. Hampton was in bed with his 8-month pregnant fiance, Deborah Johnson. She was ushered out of bed. Hampton couldn't move. And he was shot a bullet to the head, execution style. Nobody was ever tried for those killings. Later, $1.8 million quote settlement, which I'm starting to read as bounties, these financial payouts that come out of taxpayer monies. And this would include, you know, Eric Garner's death, Breonna Taylor's death. I believe hers was $12 million, using public monies to somehow bring closure, which is impossible emotionally, to assassinations of Black people. So in this framework, my understanding of abolitionism, as I learned more, both for the people who were incarcerated, and again, the trigger was me trying to be a good progressive academic and say, oh, you need books to read, let's send you ours. And the response was, well, this is nice, but it's not really relevant based on the lack of a certain depth of analysis. So my being schooled by the incarcerated led me, when I left Colorado to go to Brown, to spend 8 years inviting former political prisoners to campus, caught heat about that from my president down to my chair. And I'm sure alumni were complaining as well. And to work with the students to do these anthologies. And the students were brilliant and dedicated. If you look at imprisoned intellectuals, they did the bios on all the contributors, which could range from like World War II white pacifist resistors, right, to George Jackson, who's on the cover, to more contemporary prisoners, including Leonard Peltier, Native American political prisoner who's also been in for decades. So my work is different from other abolitionists in the sense that I tracked the rebellions. I did not focus on the suffering. So I'll give you an example of how my academic work might differ from someone else. That's like Michelle Alexander, who's made incredible contributions to the public, international and US public, for people to understand captivity in the United States tied to mass incarceration. There are some critiques about some of the content, but the thing I focus on is there is no agency in the new Jim Crow. It's about Black suffering, and you know, some of the language seems to echo that of Obama, that, you know, we change our behavior, pull up our pants, et cetera, that obviously not me, but the way in which our youth dress, that there's a way that we can reconcile with the greater America if we just explain what's going on, and that it's a human rights violation. When I look at the text and when I've taught it, I've looked for, did we ever rebel in prison? Was there ever a prison strike? Did we ever organize about this? And it's all missing, because the focal point is on Black misery and Black suffering. And then the hero of the narrative becomes, and I'd love to hear your pushback, you know, when we do the Q&A, it becomes a charge of the civic-minded citizen, right? Or the one with the kind of moral ethics that's really ethical, to kind of liberate these captives. And so it's a form of abolitionism that reproduces hierarchy and rank. And the agency drifts solidly toward the middle or upper classes, right? Because they're actually the audience of the text. I mean, I wonder if you could mail that book in, and probably it's really popular. But what I was struck by was the way I was schooled after I did Unfinished Liberation at UC Boulder, or sorry, CU Boulder in '98, that those who have intellectual capacity, who use their intellectual capacity, who analyzed the state, who organized, who saw the devastations, including the killing or assassinations of their comrades, or bogus trials that made them end up political prisoners, that their analyses would not find space in these popular publications, because their analyses would lead you down a path that the problem was not abolitionism per se, the problem was the state and its proto-fascist tendencies, right? So once I focused on the political prisoners, I was on a different path. And I think increasingly over the years, more young scholars have been writing around resistance, or as Salme Burton has a text that's coming out I guess in 2021 on Attica, interviewed the men who led the rebellion. And I'll say a little bit more about how I see these men as part of the captive maternal concept that I've been exploring for the last 5 years. So I want to sort of move on, but I want to emphasize this segment. I've argued in other writings and some talks that there's an algorithm for anti-racism and that it comes from the 18th century, right? And I talk about, I use Vincent Brown, the historian's work on Attacca's Rebellion. I believe it's a 1776 rebellion in Haiti, right? That this contemporary abolitionism that is popularized focuses on the misery and the suffering of Black people rather than the agency, because that allows a certain liberal hegemony. That the kind of Black you want is the one who's on bended knee. If you see that statue in DC where Abraham Lincoln is incredibly tall, I don't know how many feet, and there's a supplicant, a Black person on bended knee with, their shirt is torn off, their hands are clasped, they're in shackles. It's almost pleading to a white God for delivery, a white political God, right? So what Brown argues in Attacca's Rebellion, I'm sorry, I didn't write it down, but you can go the work. He's a historian at Harvard, was that the British brought to Jamaica not just workers, but also warriors, people who had been militarists on the African continent. And when they made the decision, that first we can negotiate this, and that was George Jackson in prison too, in San Quentin. He followed the rules thinking he would be let out if he conformed. And then it became very clear when the prison guards assassinated his mentors, the people who were in his study groups. W.L. Nolan is the most prominent one I can think of at this moment. It was very clear that there was no exit here, right? You were going to be a slave and be abused as such, or you were going to fight and live or die, but it would be that transition to declare the humanity, which would trigger the confrontation, right? So in Haiti, and then in Haiti, but also in Jamaica, which I'm using as an example, it's when that rebellion began that the British used incredible violence against the subjugated. And people were being unnerved by that in terms of British citizens, right? And their counter was that you had to provide a docile subject to deflate the narrative that these are armed aggressors. Does that make sense what I just said? Because this is what happened with the Panthers. The demonology around the Panthers was part of the propaganda. That's the FBI, the number one threat. So they're kind of some rogue militarist, domestic terrorist thing, right? But the counter to that is no, these are just people who want to live their lives, right? That was definitely true, but they're harmless and they're in this zone of pure victimhood, right? So you get these extrapolations of Blackness that are on opposite sides of the spectrum. And we're a full humanity like would blend the two, right? So I found in my work that is happening in the 21st century, the recycling of that old algorithm, that to be an anti-racist, one has to save Black people. It's like, not that we could save ourselves because we're quote outnumbered, but you would have to save us from our desire to rebel. That the best Black person is going to be the sufferer. And I would argue that, yes, there were millions of people who poured out in the streets around the killing of George Floyd for various reasons, probably also COVID, stress and loss and mourning. But the way in which Breonna and George Floyd can be depicted as purely victims, I mean, even Dhoruba bin Wahad, who was formerly incarcerated for 19 years as a member of the Black Liberation Army, and there was a $1 million plus settlement when he was released. Also, he's importantly noted something that we rarely talk about, is that when George Floyd was being choked to death by somebody's knee, he kept addressing him as sir, officer. Like the deferential content of language that shows that you're not a threat. And again, I just oppose with the Panthers were known for just their expletives, like motherfucker this and that, like because they were using language and performance to indifference. And again, I'm not arguing for any polarity here, but noting the distinction. So the preference, what it is easier to mobilize in the United States around the killing of a Black person who is not defending themselves or fighting back. Because then you have that perfect subject or subjugated subject or subjugated object where somebody with power can decide still whether they live or die. And it's like, we're your allies, but we have the power you don't have, right? Because you're the target, but we will be the saviors or help save you from being targeted. So the people I work with on abolitionism understand victimization, but they don't lead with it. They're more interested in agency. And that's going to take me to the captive maternal because I know we only have a little bit more time in the BIUs and the tribunal for 2021. All right. So the captive maternal as a concept came about 5 years ago when I was trying to understand how Black families operated in New York City, specifically Harlem and the Bronx, right? Harlem's being gentrified, so it was what's left of Harlem, right? And I noticed the way in which caretaking as a function, and there's a big push right now for the language of caretaking, which is important, but where the role of the caretaker was going to be either conflicted or celebratory. And that the caretaker level of the captive maternal as an abolitionist, right, was a stabilizer of the structure itself. So the narrative now that Black women elected Biden and Harris, yeah, I would accept that given the way in which the vote broke down. But in order to do that, the push was everybody had to vote whether or not you wanted to vote for the Democratic Party. And if you did not, you were irresponsible rather than, well, maybe you want to vote for what's left of the Green Party or any other party, or maybe not vote at all. And that language, disciplinary language, came from Black feminists who were leaders of the abolitionist struggle, right? So you must participate in a two-party system that is indicated that it doesn't care about poor people, that it's capitalist, it's going to stay imperialist, and it's going to be racist, but try not to be as offensive as POTUS 45, right? It's going to be subtle about its racism, and it's going to populate its cabinets with, quote, diversity hires, right? So on that level of captive maternity functioning, because the captive maternal is an ungendered function, it's not an identity formation. You can stabilize the state in ways that if you think, I've referenced it historically back to Sally Hemings, right? Who, when she was 14, and Thomas Jefferson, who would be the third president of the United States, brought her to France as a chaperone for his daughters by Sally Hemings' half-sister, Martha Jefferson, who had passed, right? She ends up being his concubine. Some people read it as a love story. My position is enslaved people can't give consent, so I don't know how that works. But every time she had a baby by Jefferson, she was contributing to the 3/5 clause in the US Constitution, which shapes the Electoral College, which is how in the US you can lose the popular vote and still be made president, which happened in 2016 with Donald Trump, right? So Sally Hemings becomes a way, the captive maternal whose biological reproduction, because every 2 slaves make 1 representational vote, right? That would go to a Southern plantation owner like Jefferson, so he could defeat John Adams in, I believe, in the early 1800s, right? When they were both combatives for president. You could read Sally Hemings as a captive maternal. You could read Michelle Obama as a captive maternal, singing the praises of the United States, but not mentioning its white supremacy, not mentioning economic devastation where the wealth kept skewing towards the top. But on this level, you either celebrate that you're a strong leader for democracy that has still at its core predatory capitalism, imperial warfare, and denigration of non-elites, or you feel conflicted. And I've used the phrase like, you know, the school that you're going to send your second grader to has a racist principal, but you want your second grader to learn how to read and not end up in juvie prison or truant, and you don't want them damaged that way, so you send them to the elementary school with a racist principal and teachers, but then you know they're going to be damaged because it's a racist principal and racist teachers, right? So that's the conundrum on that level, on that first level. You can move from that level to that of a mass movement. And I think that's what happened with Black Lives Matter. But that street movement did not come from the elites who are now recognized as the quote founders. You know, a hashtag is not a street movement, right? So the movement came from the people in Ferguson. And I've met in Chicago in 2019, Chicago mothers who've had their sons killed by police. And I also met a mother who was the activist, her son was not, but he was lynched in her yard, right? And so those women are anonymous. I know what their names are, but the world knows the names of 3 women, right? And again, there's something about abolitionism in the US that's tied to accumulation. So the street creates the rebellion, which is why the state has to pay attention and then throw money into nonprofits, or the nonprofits throw money into people. People can accumulate from their lecture fees, from book deals, from creating these nonprofits that are tied to the Democratic Party. But the people who fought in the streets, who have the agency, and I'm not a straight up militarist here, but yes, protest, physical protest and encounters with property do draw the attention of police, the state, on all levels. Those people remain anonymous and largely still are dispossessed. So there's a track in mass movements that splits. The street remains suppressed and the police remain militarized to contain them. And then sectors become siphoned off and then become pundits on television, or book authors, or $40,000 speaking gigs at elite schools and such. So that's the second level of the mass movement and its contradiction. The third, I know Professor Roberts spoke on Marronage. I'm not a historian, I have not studied it, but I have watched the people that I've talked about and studied with them and studied them, right? So I would say the Black Panther Party was a maroon party, right? That's why it had a breakfast program. That's why it had a sickle cell anemia medical program. That's why it had an educational program. That's why it had a self-defense component, that they were trying to create a separate identity, formation, consolidation, independent from the state. And I would say that the Attica Rebellion was Marronage as well. Like the men started as, and this, I'll close on this, right? Then we can talk more about BIUs and other in the Q&A, because I know I'm eating up time here. Obviously the Attica Rebellion that happened the month after George Jackson was killed in prison, right? The Attica Rebellions, before the rebellion, the men identified themselves as captive maternals. They were the ones who took care as trustees or just as friends of people they loved. They took care of the ill and the sick inside of prisons. And that's true now in the US, where COVID is rampant in some prisons and people are dying. So the people who take care of them, who feed them soup, who check their temperature, who clean the waste from their bodies, who talk to them, sing to them, pray with them, those are other incarcerated people. They are stabilizing the cage or the captivity that preys upon them with their own labor, right? So this is a conundrum. On the level that they decided they were men, and then I use that advisedly because some did not self-define as men, the state defined them as men and then placed them in a male prison. But when they moved to the movement stage for their freedom and for an identity as human, that's where you saw the mass movement in the takeover. The Marronage camp emerged when they decided we have to build latrines for waste. We need to create a food delivery system. We need to build tents. We need to have a medic center. We need to decide who's going to speak to the press, the New York Times, who's going to draw up our list of demands and so forth. That was part of the Marronage. That was an understanding of collective labor to build a community under siege. That is the third stage. The fourth and final stage is a war resistor. My understanding of history in the United States is that it allows little autonomy for its former captives, right? So if you think of the bombing of the Move House in the 1980s in Philadelphia, and then the arrest of Move, people before then and after then, if you think of what happened with the Panthers and the raids on their maroon camps or their Marronage, Nelson Rockefeller as governor, Richard Nixon, then president, the National Guard that used military technology from Vietnam, and the taking back of the prison, treated it as a war zone. They shot through white guards to kill Black activists. They stripped the men, they tortured them, they sexually assaulted them, and the retaking. There's an understanding in the full circle, if you want to see it as that, or the 4 seasons that we keep going through. There's understanding that the desire to be free as an abolitionist will eventually lead to a path of the confrontation with the state that wants to consider itself predator and you prey. I would argue that the academy and most academics are hesitant or resistant to the concept of war, which I talked about. War is not a metaphor as the closing segment of the piece I did on abolitionism, airbrushing revolution for the sake of abolition. But in my understanding of the captive maternal, and my understanding about how Black people live and love and also fight and die, these seem to be the very clear stages that we cycle in and out of. And the capacity of the community to understand that seems to be greater than the capacity of the academic working in a professionalized industry. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much. We can all applaud or think of questions to ask. And the floor is open for questions. Anyone can add a question to the chat or raise your hand and we can call on you. I know that Shruti and I had a lot of questions, and what you were talking about at the end there, if no one else has a question to start us off, I can kind of ask to hear more about how I think I'm going to phrase it. So Shruti, you can modify as you'd like. Violence becomes abstract and the different modes of framing it. So like absorbing it into the legal system through the human rights framework, or the very act of just writing, creating a separation. Like I've been thinking a lot about Maya Angelou's like I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and different ways that might be taken by different people. In also like the captive maternal like narrative as well, retrospectively after I discovered what you were writing about, but also the ways which has become super salient, where it's become exploited, and what used to be useful for people trying to work within activism might become co-opted. So like structural racism has become a big word, and I think that can make violence seem more abstract now, rather than invoking people to like the responsibility that they have for actively perpetrating violence every day, and different ways to navigate that and also constantly impress it upon yourself, in the ways in which you inflict it or it's inflicted upon you. Shruti, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's sort of related to like this is that, well, I guess like I see like the work that you've been telling us about today, but also like works by Professor Cherise Burden-Stelly, who she talks on the McCarthyite structure of feeling, and I think it's such a useful framework where she really ties together like anti-Black governmental policies and in terms of like military and police policies with like radicalism and Black radicalism. I think like there's that, like, and I think this relates to what you're talking about in the 4 stages, right? Because there's that, and then there are the like literary, philosophical, even poetic ways of thinking about injustice and thinking about it in a very broad like scale as a structure, but also understanding it on an intellectual level, where I think the abstractions can be very useful as part of our analysis, but sometimes also inhibit the way that we can actually fight against like injustice that is happening like materially, like in real time. I guess like something that pops to mind immediately is conversations that we have within the movement in terms of violence and non-violence, and like what type of like sort of rebelling or what type of like revolt we should be part of. And there are those who make very well articulated arguments for non-violent protest, right? But I think that there are things that sit that sound great on an intellectual level and make sense in theory, and then in real life, when you are like when you have to like sort of live with the policies that are enacted against like political radicals, then I think you can make very good arguments against. But yeah,
I think one of the things like I always want to be careful, not just because I want to keep my job, right? But so I don't say that I'm for any kind of militarist endeavor, but I do consistently say that I understand the right to self-defense, right? And the charge I've made, like I can't tell academics what to do, right? But at least with working with my students, I argue that political education is the most important weapon, if you want to think in terms of weapons, right? Or weaponry. So your capacity to analyze not just the past in terms of theory, but also the present moment, where there's so much ideology and deception. I mean, really a lot of, especially with the way that technology proliferates messaging all over, and then adds like all those subliminal messages, and then it's got color codes and the visuals, yank you in. You would have to be able to think independently of the marketing. So part of the problem is the Black left is marketing. It's not like, oh, these are the conditions, other than like we've got the stats on it. And I like Cherise's work too, so I'm not talking about her work, right? But Archie Mafije wrote an article, I believe it was 1993. And I'm going to paraphrase the title. It's something like Strange Bedfellows, Black Nationalists and White Liberals. And he wasn't talking like Black nationalists like Kwanzaa, Black nationalists. I used, liberation movements on the continent. And what his argument is, what he argued in that piece was that it was okay to have a Black leader. Like nobody really cares. I mean, whatever like reactionary whites care about, it wasn't registering, it wasn't that significant. You could have Black faces anywhere, but the liberal hegemony had to control the codes of defining reality, right? And I would argue in the United States, our Black official leadership has agreed to those terms. Like you can have Black faces everywhere, particularly Black women's faces or Black female faces, Black trans faces, whatever. But when it comes down to defining the nature of the struggle and how we struggle, that is going to revert to the people who actually have the codes, right? And that's going to be a form of white liberalism. which will not tear down its own structure. So this is when, you know, these battles, I'm not in it. Yeah, I try to not be in academic culture more than like being present for my students, right, and doing my work. But the battles I've seen between Afro-pessimists, and then I'll just call them the anti-Afro-pessimists, because I don't know what they're calling themselves, and they'd be offended if I said they were Black liberals, right? But I think that battle is around definitional norms. Like the Afro-pessimists are trashing white liberal hegemony. Like, we don't care what your definitional norms are, what your grammar, your syntax, we don't speak that language anymore. Where there's a group that's opposing them, and yes, there's some things you could critique about their construct, but if you understand their political project, it is to, you know, the whole end of the world thing is to rewrite the alphabet, right? And other people like, there are rules here, like follow the rules. We have an alphabet. We're going to use the current one and we're going to make it better and multicultural or whatever it is they thought they could do. When you don't have the codes, you don't control the stuff. And so so then it becomes personal attacks, not on the Afro-pessimists, because they tend not to attack people. And they're still the underdog, even though Frank Wilderson's book was on the list or nominated, right, for awards, et cetera, et cetera. But their political project I find fascinating. And I met Wilderson and Sexton. I brought them to Brown when they were grad students, and I put them on the platform with Sophia Bukhari, was a Republic of New Africa, been incarcerated for 8 years, had a forced hysterectomy. Her Black bodyguards were murdered in front of her, literally in a convenience store. They just, you know, the white owner and his son, shot them first and then stomped on them to death, right? So that, you know, the killing of Black agency is more than rhetorical and performative. It's just literally what Leopold probably did in Belgium. I mean, not on that level, not that you didn't pick enough, I'm chopping off your hand, the irrational level of it, right? So I appreciate the Afro-pessimists if they're like, you can't logically analyze this and have a good outcome. You have to talk about what's going on in mass psychology. You have to talk about desire, repression, rage. And so they throw as much on the table as they think you can handle. And then they tell you, this is not a conflict, this is antagonism, so this is war. I mean, they keep coming down to the basics, it's war. So if most of the academy is saying this is not war, this is a conflict, and if we just get more of us in the structure, or we get more grants, or we get more publications, et cetera, then you could see how they would never agree on the nature of abolitionism or the nature of struggle. And we don't have open debates about that, which is really unfortunate. I would just like, okay, we have a problem here. Why don't we just bring it out in the open and just like hash out and see what works? But the loyalty, I would argue, is for liberal hegemony. And so they foreclose the possibility of debate. They'll definitely discipline you, but they won't debate you, if that makes sense.
That is very interesting reading of Afro-pessimism. Definitely, like, I think, like, you know, it has come up in other talks as well. A very different reading to what, well, at least in my opinion, like, you know, to what like a lot of other scholars have said. And I think that like adds very, like, you know, sort of new layer to my understanding of it.
I've called it a messy and imperfect love story. And it doesn't really matter if you have a white mother or a white wife. I'm like, why do y'all even care? And how do you know? But it's really the intent of the mission, right? It's like you can love whoever you want. But my reading of them is that they've assessed the territory, the lay of the land, and they're like Assata, you cannot reform this. So let's stop playing around like we can. And then what path would take us conceptually, theoretically, off the treadmill of reform? And so if it wasn't going to be Afro-pessimism, it was going to be something else. Like you can't, I mean, I guess you could keep rereading Fanon and Marx and everybody else to say stay within the present order, or you could read George Jackson, which the Afro-pessimists do, and say, well, the present order is designed to extract for the sake of extraction, which means it's not just for accumulation, it's just for like predatory pleasure. And we're done with the present order.
Yeah.
You know, and I would say the vast majority, I don't have a head count, but I would say on the elite level in the academy, most people are loyal to the present order.
I think we have another question from Bennett. So,
So, I had a question about, I guess, Afro-pessimism specifically. I asked a similar question when Tommy Curry was speaking, which is just about the relationship between Afro-pessimism and action. And the reason I ask is I mean, pessimism as a term, as a philosophical term, kind of begs that question. But also when you get into like the very, like, I guess, question of what should be done, you know, which maybe even asking that question is the wrong way to start. But you have, like, in Calvin Warren's book, he's putting forward this nihilist ethic where he's saying, don't do anything, in essence, like, don't revolt. He describes being at a conference after, I think it was the killing of Michael Brown, where people are discussing, you know, activist strategies, and they're saying, what's the point? And he describes that as his nihilist ethic, you know?
Yeah. I hear things, and I'm glad you raised that because it's really concrete. So I'll tell you my experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason I invited them to Brown was because they were activists. Like if I put them on the panel with, you know, Safia Bukhari, who passed a number of years ago, but who was first in the Panthers, and then the FBI is trying to kill her, so she goes underground, and then they end up murdering her body. I mean, like, no, that's, for me, that's as close as you can get to risking your life in activism, right? They know the same people. And they know the same people, not in abstraction, they know the same people. When I mentioned that Jalil Muntaqim, when I wrote to him, well, of course I knew the Panthers, so they told me about him. But when I had to decide in one of the anthologies, don't remember which one, if I was gonna print Jalil's complete text on what he did and why he did it, I was hearing from my colleagues elsewhere and some of my students, like, no, you can't print that. That's going to be a career killer. It's like, I'm tenured already, but whatever. But then I called Wilderson, and he was like, ask Jalil. And also I was told by attorneys, Jalil will never get out. I'm not going to say because I published it, it took another 20 some years, whatever. But I wrote to Jalil, and he's like, I stand by it. So it's like, that's a form of sacrifice and activism too, that I stand by my intellect, not retracting. This is my assessment, right? So this is the way I see the world, because I used to be an activist. I've traveled some, you know, when the Contra Wars were going on, I went to Latin America. I met the Salvadorans who the US was paying for terrorists, right? The people who survived attacks but were missing arms because they've been chopped off by machetes. And you talk to people and you see what they will risk. Wilderson and Sexton both taught in the prisons until they were kicked out. The reason they were kicked out is they did the same thing Frank said about Jalil. You ask the incarcerated what they want to do. If they're willing to risk their lives or risk a beatdown or risk solitary confinement, the least you can do is back them instead of act like the captive maternal in zone 1, like the principal or the parent, like, no, that's a bad idea. You need to be responsible and follow orders. If they're understanding that predator captors are destroying their lives and they want to resist that, they backed him, and then they got banned from teaching inside. So this is why I'm always a little hesitant, you know, because I've been on these, you know, academic things, and they're talking about Wilderson's last book, which is really popular. You know, he said clearly, I'm just popularizing the idea. You have to read his other stuff. But they start talking about fictive, like, it's like Zambi, you know, was it Audre Lorde's memoir, Zambi, which is like part real and part, it's like, no, everybody is real. I mean, you don't want them to be devastated and you don't want them to sue you, so you give them a pseudonym, but everybody is real. So I think on the level back to the industry of academia, it is not rooted in working class or impoverished neighborhoods. Like, your university is not embedded in public housing. It is the elite. They don't risk like this. And to the extent that they know people who risk like this, usually they're taking a deposition or collecting data to write about. So if you want the end of the world, that's not because you want to go out in a blaze of fire. What you're saying about the end of the world means you want the end of the predatory world, which means you want the end of your predator. So that's a fight. And that's not what we're trained to do as academics. We're not supposed to fight. We're supposed to collect data, make it more intellectual, or, put our name on it and build, a career portfolio. So I am not an Afro-pessimist, but I've been around long enough outside of the academy to kind of recognize the people who've actually aligned themselves with movements. These guys have been in movements. Granted, we were not old enough to be in the Panthers, and I honestly probably wouldn't have the courage to be in the Panthers, but I definitely would have been in a support network. And everybody, to the extent we've done anything, we all have FBI files. That's not bragging anything. It's just like basic, that if you know certain people and you move in certain circles, the state knows you. And the function of the academy is not to be in those circles, other than like when the dust settles, you can document it and then be the authority on what went down. Does that make sense? So that's what I mean. It's like, I feel in a way that there's the Black intellectuals, we're having a clash and we're going to split. And it's different from decades ago when there weren't these many Black intellectuals in white universities. So Angela becomes one of the first, right? And then, I mean, that's historic, 1969, the first Black person to teach philosophy. But now 50 years out, we're at Harvard, we're teaching all over. And so now we're part of the edifice. Then the question becomes, what are we loyal to? Which is definitely not rebellion, even on a cognitive theoretical level. And again, the Afro-pessimists are I know there are Marxists and other people writing, but the Afro-pessimists are attacked so vigorously. I kind of feel like they stirred the hornet's nest. And that means that something political is going on. I just am not able to completely articulate what it is.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? If not, I have another related one, but I can give someone else a chance to ask. If not, no. So I was actually thinking about this, and we were talking a bit about this at the beginning, and I was about to ask about the split that you thought might occur in relation to how caring community building can also be co-opted. And there's been a lot of academic work on that recently, but it could also help perpetuate kind of like the caring for the community in order to continue to be like marketed upon, or kills like that it continues to fuel the fire that's burning it. And the speakers we've had this term, as well as some other intellectuals, range a lot in their opinions on that. And I've been having difficulty trying to navigate that and figure out what I think, like, say, if I juxtapose, say, like bell hooks with Tommy J. Curry, and even like within Bell's work, it has ranged over time, and trying to figure out, I mean, I'd be curious what your opinions are on that and what to do.
Yeah, that's helpful. I would be interested in the relationship between caretaking or care community and rebellion.
Yeah.
Because if the care community is, I mean, we all need health, and it's not like our situation in the US is very different from yours, right? Even though I'm sort of hearing that your essential workers that you lost were kind of reflected like our essential workers, you know, women, people of color, you know, nurses, aides type thing. You know, the mortality rate centers in part around this care community. So we take the model within our communities, and the way I've heard it talked about in abolitionism in the US, it's always to de-escalate violence in our communities, which is very important, especially in New York City, where we're having all this gun violence spike, right? And we could add Chicago and elsewhere. But there's two things on that. Like one, where are the kids getting the pieces, right? And so that's gun, because it's hard to get a gun in New York. Like military bases, grew up in Texas, we all had guns, right? Me too. It was easy to get a gun. Everybody had a gun in the house, you know. And our communities were not good on care. Like, you know, Texans are humans, but they're not like the most caring in some ways with that whole Lone Star State. You know, we're an imperial state within imperial nation formation. The problems that I start to sense about the care community is when they start looking like social workers. And all the problems are about de-escalating internal violence in the community. And then I ask questions like, so what happens, like you stabilize somebody, you care for them, and then the police come in and traumatize them. So tell me how you deal with the police and the state inflicting trauma. Or, you know, you can't get a college education, so you're going to enlist in the military, and then you're going to invade some other land and kill or help kill people somewhere else, which also becomes traumatic. So we have veterans committing suicide on a daily basis in the United States. And this, some people don't like the term endless wars, but that's what's been going on in the Middle East and elsewhere. Now we're with AFRICOM on the African continent, and we're militarizing that. And so the deaths of civilians are spiking, people are watching war crimes, and they're coming back to the US dysregulated. So my father was an officer in Vietnam, came back from Vietnam, highly dysregulated. So it's not as if the state is going to suspend its harm doing while we internally try to fix our communities as if they're isolates and protected from the state. The state comes in through its police forces. Our communities go out through either joining the police in some ways or being harmed by the police, right? And then going to jail where you'll be tortured psychologically, emotionally, if not physically. Or they're seeking employment options and they go into some kind of military formation, including private mercenary armies. I'm sure they have nicer names in the US, but basically we have a mercenary force parallel to our former military, or people leave the military and they join private armies, corporate armies that are sent to supplement our military, but at higher pay, and they go back to the Middle East as a private employee, right? We would have to take on the issue of violence in all its aspects simultaneously. So I wonder sometimes with the social worker mandate, and the social worker can take your children from you. So that's a form of harm, which means a social worker is a proxy for the police. And disproportionately in the United States, even though Black families are no more dysfunctional or pathological than any other families, but because of anti-Black racism, our children are disproportionately removed. And then they end up in foster care or other sites, and then they become even more damaged and dysregulated and engage in self-harm and harm towards others. The only way I could see breaking that cycle would be to confront both forms or vectors of violence simultaneously. Or as Sophia Bukhari would say, when the FBI was trying to kill them, and then Huey Newton from the West Coast sent death squads to kill the Panthers who wouldn't send him money or pledge to him, right? This is what she said at Brown years ago, we were stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I think our communities are stuck between rocks and hard places, and probably there's a third zone of threat, right? So when I've been on these virtual forums with international people who probably, you know, maybe on a list somewhere, they talk about democratizing violence. And first I didn't understand it and I had to think about it. And then I started to increasingly think we would have to control violence in our communities and against our communities without falling into that caretaker mold, that first level of the captive maternal, which means I know 2 young people, Black activists, well 3, who had their heads cracked open by the NYPD and peaceful protests this past spring, right? And now the joke, it's a macabre joke, right, is everybody's going to make money off their head, because New York City's going to have to pay tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for police brutality. So this is when I come back to the police. Instead of tracking the gun runners, they pulled people from these undercover units in order to intimidate protesters who were peaceful and to brutalize them. And I've never, fortunately, had my head cracked open, but if you do, I imagine there's trauma that's going to follow that, and you're going to need a therapist, and you're going to need some rehab, et cetera, et cetera. You have to control the police. You cannot control the police unless you control the state. Even Obama said when Baltimore kind of erupted after Freddie Gray died, when his spine was severed in police custody, when they gave him the so-called rough ride, first he called the protesters thugs, then he walked it back, and then finally said he could not federalize the police, which meant he cannot control them. Which at that point I was like, oh, you're the POTUS, man. You're the president of the United States. You're telling me, well, then why am I even talking to you? So like the community has to decide what risk they can tolerate to control police. The New York police, NYPD, are international. It is literally like an army with a whole propaganda machine because they have unions. I know people who are running for mayor, Black women, Black Latinx, Black Puerto Rican. I'm like, do you really want to do this? Because you're going to have to come up against this formation that in its sensibilities is aligned to Trump. But Trump has just been on the scene the last 4 years. They're aligned to the vision that violence dominates in democracy, and democracy isn't for everybody. So therapy won't get you through that. A revolution might, but it won't get you can't go through a revolutionary process without sacrificing something. So back to Captive Maternal stage 1, you're going to hedge your bets. Maybe the other kids will get brutalized, or they'll be roughed up or have a rough ride or have their head cracked open or be choked out on the street. But I'll make sure my kids go to good schools and good colleges and universities, and they won't be caught in that zone. So the therapeutic is essential, but it is irrelevant unless you can stop the source of violence, which is the state, which you're paying for through your taxes. So we're funding our own predator formations against us.
I think that's a really that thing that you just said about the NYPD being international. And I mean, I guess it brings us quite well to your work with the Internationalist Abolitionist Union. If you wanted to talk about that, but something that I would actually really be interested to hear about is how you've even managed to get tenure and remain within the university sphere doing the work you do. I can imagine the policing and the surveillance.
Yeah, we can try both of those. So I was trained by Jesuits, and later I went to seminary and I worked with Cornel West and James Cone, who passed last year. James Cone did, right? Yeah. Well, so in a way, I was trained by probably Republicans and Jesuits, which is about as conservative as it gets. But I also, followed a particular religion. They're all problematic. They all have predator formations, including, I realized, the Buddhists when I looked at what was going on in Myanmar against the Rohingya. Honestly, I walked without a letter after I did the dissertation on Hannah Arendt, because I was just so angry at the people who, quote, trained me in political philosophy. So I ended up going in seminary, partly preference, but also, I refused to get a job letter from any of them. So yeah, how did I ever get a job? I would like to think that my representation of communities as I see them, and the representation is imperfect, was if you go shopping, there's a niche market, and that people wanted that you know, oh, I got one of these, I got one of that. Did I get one? No, we didn't get one of those. Like, where's the community focused thing? How I made it into the Ivies could be the Orisha or a dedication to a certain kind of work that was really pushed, or I pushed it to the extent of my capacity, which sometimes means to the extent of a nervous breakdown, right? That you're just like revisiting, rewriting, and you're frightened because you're like, oh my God, look at this is emerging, and this isn't supposed to be here, and everybody's gonna hate it, and nobody's gonna read it, and I'm not gonna get a job. And I followed it, and it happened. I would say earlier in my career, I was more liberal. And that's when you get the Angela Davis reader, and that's when you get Transcending the Talented 10th. And then as I matured intellectually, I stopped doing this like recuperation project, like let's recover the stories of Black women, as important as that is. And I started looking at what's in these stories and what's contradictory, and how does it relate to the current crisis, the current struggle. So part of this is exhausting because everything feels like a crisis. And when you're the US, because it's imperial, yeah, everything pretty much is. And we kind of have our hands on a lot of different levers that produce different levels of dispossession and death. I love people in general, but I really love people who want to be free and who take risk. And so whatever risk I took pale in comparison to the people I've met. And I don't deify them. I don't think they always did the right thing, but they literally risked their lives for something they believed in, which means I can risk my career for something I believe in. And yes, another, the BIUs. So the BIUs, bunch of sisters, right? They were born in different places, Rwanda, Ethiopia, brothers, a couple brothers, Cameroon, Georgia, whatever. Like I said, I grew up on military bases in the States, but born in Europe. I was in the Abolition Collective for a while, and the pandemic hit New York, so we were the epicenter, and we went from 20 people dying a day in their apartments to 200. And like I've said before, I live like in this modest condo between like multi-million-dollar buildings and public housing, NYCHA. But their ambulance sirens 24 hours a day, that meant the people in NYCHA were dying at 200 a rate a day. And that kind of pushed me further in terms of my critique. So I went to the Abolition Collective, and it's like, I know you guys are planning conferences or whatever you're doing, but we need to do something about the pandemic. So we started doing this organizing, and then it became very challenging around Black voices, Black women's voices, how we critique things. They weren't always compatible. And I was like, look, we're going to do Black internationalist unions here, because we can't keep having debates in a moment of crisis. We can't continuously have debates about the relevance of race and what it means. And we don't do mandatory people of color stuff. And I will say, you know, based on the work and what I know from Angela, and, you know, Gilmore sort of says there's green and there's red, but there's no Black. So Ruth Gilmore doesn't seem to really be that interested in race. But Davis, it was always women of color, what's possibility as a race, like this whole formation. I'm like, that's not grounded in any reality that I share, right? Because I know children, I know elders, and I know people who identify as men. So we formed the BIUs. It turned out to be mostly Black women. And then it turned out in a weird way that we're all teaching at elite universities in different parts of the country. So we're too insulated, I would say. But then when we actually start talking, we may be employed in these sectors, but we don't give them our full attention. So we work with communities that understand community aid, self-defense, and various formations. And the next project we're doing is War is Not a Metaphor. So we're open to anybody who has any critiques or analysis and want to post. And we're definitely work some with the Brazilians. We're going to, we don't want it to be US centric anymore. And I think because some of the other sisters, because they come from the continent, they have more of a critical lens of how Black people in the US can also sort of coast, like surf on that imperial ethos that comes out of the US. Like we export everything. We export Black feminism, but we also export Disney and McDonald's, right? So like you have to be selective. So that's what the BI uses. And the last thing is the spirit of Mandela. So I had a whole debate, because I have a critique of Mandela, even though I know he suffered 27 years. But when I've been in South Africa, I've heard, people have different perspectives. And I think of Chris Hani, and back to the Afro-Pessimists, they actually know who Chris Hani is, which I think a number of academics do not, and they know how he died. And I remember when I was at UMass, the South Asian grad students asked me if I would do something, UMass Amherst, in honor of Hani on MLK, Martin Luther King Day, and I did. But a number of the Black Americans, clergy, whatever, in the room, people in the faith, and that's the faith I'm in too, they weren't interested in Hani because he's a communist, and they weren't interested in the fact that he was assassinated in his driveway. And so again, there's a way in which this focus solely on the US has lacked an international perspective unless there's something to be gained by our internationalism. When it comes to like, hey, do you want to talk about AFRICOM? And do you want to talk about Obama's drone strikes? And would you like to talk, there's not a lot of interest unless you're talking to a serious, I'll say more serious aspect of the radical left. And I will say that about the abolitionists too. Like, yes, it's important to talk about Palestine, but there's much less information I hear or discourse I hear about US foreign policy on the continent or what's being done in Haiti, right? Or, again, it's the export of militarism and the extraction of resources. If we focused on US foreign policy, that would be enough to go for a national strike if we really cared and sort of cripple the economy. But I've not heard many calls for that. So hopefully the tribunal will raise attention to not what only happens internally, and the internal I say is embodied in Fannie Lou Hamer, but also the external in terms of the contribution that all the Mandelas gave us, obviously not just Nelson.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. We are thinking before we have to end. And I can always ask more questions because I have them, but I really, if anyone else does have a question.
Also, it doesn't have to be a question, it can just be a comment or just to say hi even would be nice, but yeah.
Oh, well, I will go.
Okay, if there's one last thing, right? Okay. I'm trying to find the words for this. It's really important to me right now that people are able to demystify the iconic. And that would include the left iconography. There's been so much corporate funding that has gone into our movements over the last half century, and not all of it is publicly known, that what we think we're embracing as a symbol of fundamental change or transformative, reality or desire is actually paid for. And it's not paid for by raising money in Black churches or Black union halls or among the workers in agricultural fields. That money is coming from top down, and it's exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars. So part of what is going to unfold is the ability to demystify hagiography and our own desire to be rescued by exceptional people. There's no way going forward without no forms of suffering, but our capacity to love ourselves, if that's self-care, right, will alleviate or at least allow us to reconcile with the pain. And so I think that's the hardest takeaway as an intellectual. There's no way that any of this changes without us suffering. And if all the other narratives are about we can end your suffering if you just elect the right people, or if you just join our movement, or if you just remember to vote, or if you get a good therapist, or if you have community, like, nah, that I've been around too long. That's not really how it plays out. The predatory formation and its members are clear. They don't mind people dying as long as it's not them. And they don't mind helping to kill people as long as they can accumulate. And so that's simple math. I mean, when somebody does simple math, and then I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. But I think there's a lot of bells, whistles, like the Wizard of Oz. Like people prefer to have the wizard behind the curtain, creating this magical land of possibility, rather than go back to Kansas in black and white, you know, back to the farm and just do the labor. But that's where the love is, right? That's why Dorothy wanted to go back. I don't know even why you went there with Dorothy, but I think you get what I'm saying. So I appreciate your time and your intellect and your work. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think that there's still so much, I mean, there's so much to talk about because there's so much to be done. And I think that's why your work is so powerful. So hopefully we'll email you, and hopefully we can provide some follow-up readings if you have any further recommendations. That's what we normally do, but probably also recommend some of your books. Yeah, I mean, we can, if anyone has time and wants to continue talking, we normally or sometimes do that. I know Shruti has to go. But
we can close now.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you very much. With everyone else, symbolically, thank you. I'm sure everyone's really grateful, and then we'll share this later. But really, thank you so much. It was really excited to meet you, and it's been great.
Same here, and I definitely appreciate your questions and
I
comments.
think, sorry, I'll stop the recording now, but we can stay on the call if anyone would like to. Yeah.
All righty.
Great.
Stay